This is the placemat that we are going to make using the jelly roll race technique for making the body, the borders, the quilting, and the binding. To start off, we're going to need to have 4 jelly roll strips for our body of the placemat. And then we're going to need 3 more strips. One of these is going to be for the border and the other ones are going to be part of the binding. And then we also need a good generous size fat quarter that'll be our backing, and a scrap piece of batting. I use warm and white on this because it's one that I happen to have. And these are the materials that we're going to use to create our mini jelly roll placemat. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our 4 jelly roll strips that we have designated for our body, and we're going to sew them together using a bias diagonal seam. And we're going to start out by using right sides together of 2 of the pieces of fabric. And on my machine, I have laid a piece of tape. This tape is directly along the line of stitching if I were sewing very, very straight. It's going to help me to align my 2 pieces of jelly roll strips so that I can make an accurate seam that's going to be a good bias seam, but I don't need to pin. And if you need to pin, you can, but you don't really have to. So the piece of tape can help me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be using it to help me aim and make my seam in the right direction. So I'm going to line up my needle right where my 2 pieces intersect on the top side. And then I'm going to line up the place where my 2 pieces intersect so that the little V that these 2 pieces make are going to run right alongside the edge of that tape. And then as I sew and I keep on that line, that's going to help me to make a nice straight diagonal bias seam. And now when I take this off, you can see that we have a good diagonal seam. And you can either trim this now or you can trim this later. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trim this now so that I don't have to fool with it later on. And then I've got a good straight diagonal seam right like that. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my next piece of fabric and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do the bottom part. The bottom piece of fabric is going to be laying on my sewing machine in a horizontal position, and my top piece of fabric is laying on the sewing machine in a vertical position, and then I'm going to turn it sideways. I'm going to put my needle right where those 2 pieces intersect, and this little V down here is going to line up directly with the piece of tape as I follow it up. And I end up right exactly in that corner with my seam. And I'm going to cut this excess off, cut my threads off too. And then I've got another good straight bias seam. And now I'm going to do my last one for the body of the actual jelly roll body. Now, if you were sewing a regular jelly roll quilt, you would have 40 strips to sew instead of 4. And so this part of it would take you a lot longer than what it's taking me right now because you have so many to sew. You would have a strip that would go all the way across the room, and probably would take you 45 minutes to sew them all together. since we're not going to do all that, this part of it is going to take a much shorter amount of time. And now we have our 4 strips sewn together. And what we need to do right now is we need to iron these seams open and iron this flat. Okay, now I have my seams ironed open so that they look like this. When I'm sewing a Jelly Roll Race quilt body together, the technique that we're going to use is we're going to take 2 ends of our Jelly Roll strips, line them up together, and sew a seam so that there's a seam holding the 2 strips together. In order to make an interesting pattern for our body of our quilt, we want to take away 1/2 of one end of our jelly roll. And so this one I'm going to use later on. I'll probably end up using it for part of my binding later on, but so I won't waste it, but I'm not going to use it right now. So I have the green is at one end, and if I kind of just work my way down along these strips so that I don't end up with a twisted mess, I'm going to end up with the other end of the quilt, and I'm going to lay these 2 on top of each other like this, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam down this side. I'm going to go from one end to the other, and when I get to the other end, I will cut my my end apart. It's making a big loop right now. And so I'm going to cut my loop